Have you ever spent so much time alone that being around people started to feel exhausting? At first, solitude can feel peaceful. It feels like freedom, like relief, like space to breathe. But after a while, something begins to change. Conversations feel harder, social situations feel heavier, and the idea of connecting with people starts to feel strangely overwhelming. You may even begin to prefer isolation, not because it makes you happy, but because it feels easier. And that's when being alone stops being rest and starts changing the way your brain works. Most people think loneliness is just an emotion, a temporary feeling that comes and goes. But the truth is that prolonged isolation affects the brain in ways that are much deeper than most people realize. Human beings are wired for connection. Social interaction is not just something we enjoy. It is something the brain depends on. Relationships regulate emotions, stimulate mental activity, and create a sense of safety. When those interactions disappear for long periods of time, the brain begins to adapt, and not always in healthy ways. One of the first things that happens when you're always alone is that your brain becomes more sensitive to social stress. This sounds contradictory because many people believe that avoiding social interaction makes them more comfortable. In the short term, it can, but over time, the lack of regular interaction makes social situations feel less familiar, and the brain interprets unfamiliar situations as more threatening. This means the longer you stay isolated, the more difficult social interaction can feel, even when part of you wants connection. This is one of the reasons people who spend a lot of time alone often feel anxious around others. It's not because they suddenly dislike people. It's because the brain has adapted to isolation as the new normal. Social interaction begins to require more mental effort, more emotional energy, and more uncertainty. What used to feel natural can start to feel draining. Another major change happens in the brain's reward system. Positive social interaction releases dopamine and oxytocin, chemicals linked to pleasure, trust, and emotional bonding. These are part of what make human connection feel rewarding. But when social stimulation decreases for long periods, the brain receives less of those signals. As a result, motivation can drop, mood can flatten, and everyday life can begin to feel emotionally dull. This is why chronic loneliness often feels like emptiness. It isn't just emotional pain. It's a lack of the neurochemical rewards that come from connection. The brain begins operating with less reinforcement, and that can slowly reduce the sense of pleasure in daily life. Activities that once felt enjoyable can start to feel flat, not because they changed, but because the brain's reward system is understimulated. Another effect of prolonged isolation is increased self-focus. When people spend too much time alone, their thoughts have fewer interruptions. There are fewer conversations, fewer shared experiences, fewer external perspectives. As a result, the mind turns inward more often. At first, this can feel reflective, but over time it can become rumination. Thoughts begin to loop. Worries become louder. Insecurities grow without challenge. Without outside interaction to balance internal thoughts, the mind can become trapped in its own patterns. This is one of the darkest psychological effects of isolation. When there is no outside feedback, your thoughts start feeling more absolute. Doubts feel like truths. Fears feel like reality. Negative assumptions go unchallenged. And because the brain naturally has a negativity bias, it often fills that silence with self-criticism, anxiety, or imagined rejection. Over time, this can change emotional regulation. Social interaction helps regulate stress by reminding the brain that support exists. But when someone is isolated for long periods, stress becomes a more solitary experience. Without emotional connection, the nervous system remains under more pressure. Cortisol levels can rise, anxiety becomes easier to trigger, and emotional resilience decreases. In simple terms, the brain becomes more vulnerable to stress when it feels alone for too long. Isolation can also begin to reshape identity. A large part of how people understand themselves comes through interaction with others. Relationships reflect parts of who we are. Conversations, reactions, shared moments, all of these help define self-perception. But when those reflections disappear, identity can start to feel less stable. People may begin to feel invisible, disconnected, or emotionally detached from their own lives. This is why prolonged loneliness often creates a strange numbness. It's not always dramatic sadness. Sometimes it feels like emotional distance from everything, from other people, from life, even from yourself. The brain is adapting to a lack of connection by reducing emotional intensity. And while that may protect against pain, it also reduces warmth, excitement, and engagement. The most dangerous part is that the brain starts making isolation feel safer than connection. Because relationships involve uncertainty, vulnerability, and emotional risk, while isolation feels predictable. So the brain learns to prefer the safety of solitude, even while suffering from the effects of loneliness. This creates a painful paradox. The very thing that could heal the problem, human connection, begins to feel like the hardest thing to seek. That is why many people who feel lonely withdraw even more. It's not because they don't need people. It's because their brain has associated social contact with effort and isolation with safety. And the longer this pattern continues, the stronger it becomes. But the brain is adaptable in both directions. Just as it adapts to isolation, it can readapt to connection. Small social interactions can begin restoring the reward signals the brain has been missing. Meaningful conversations can reduce stress. Safe relationships can rebuild emotional regulation. Even brief moments of connection remind the brain that social interaction is not danger. It is nourishment. The important thing to understand is that being alone is not the problem. Solitude can be healthy, restorative, and deeply valuable. The problem begins when isolation becomes chronic and the brain starts adapting to disconnection as a permanent state. That is when loneliness stops being a feeling and starts becoming a pattern. The truth is that the human brain is built for connection, not constant noise, not endless socializing, but real connection. And when that connection disappears for too long, the brain changes in ways that affect mood, motivation, stress, and identity. But those changes are not permanent. The same brain that adapted to isolation can heal through connection. If this video helped you understand what loneliness may be doing beneath the surface, take a moment to like it so more people can understand what their minds are going through. Subscribe to the channel for more psychology-based insights about behavior, emotion, and the hidden ways the brain adapts to life experiences. And in the comments, tell me this. Do you think being alone gives you peace, or has it started to change you? Sometimes recognizing the difference is where healing begins. I'll see you in the next video.